Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Mark O'Kane, who's one of our consultants at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider Talk Cyber. So today we're going to be talking about the identify function within the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or NIST CSF. So Mark, can you just tell us, to start us off, what the identify function is and where does it sit within the overall framework?
Sure. So the identify function basically forms the second core function in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework after the govern function. The main aim of this function is to help organizations understand at a high level the cybersecurity risks that are relevant to them. So this includes things like identifying and managing your assets, so understanding what the resources are within our business that are adding value to our business, making sure those assets are well maintained and looked after so that they continue to add value. It also requires organizations to assess the cybersecurity risks to your organization. So we've already identified the risks to the business. We now need to assess them. And also, the function requires organizations to use this information to improve their cybersecurity program over time, wherever possible. So this is very important because it helps organizations to ensure that whatever their risk management strategy might be and whatever activities they may be undertaking as part of that, these activities are consistent with the organization's mission and their overall risk management strategy.
Right. Thank you, Mark. You mentioned that the requirements of the identify function include identifying and managing your assets. What does the NIST CSF expect organizations to actually do to achieve this in practice?
So as I mentioned, an asset is something that adds value to your organization. So this typically includes things like your company data, any hardware or software that you use as a business, any physical premises that you have, as well as your people. So that includes your employees, contractors, as well as any other third-party personnel that are providing a service to your business. So as we said, NIST requires these to be identified and managed. So how organizations identify these assets is up to them. It can be done by consulting senior management or department heads. But at a high level, it requires you to look at what's adding value to your business. This is important because asset management helps organizations to not only know what their assets are, but also to understand who's responsible for them, where they are located, how they need to be maintained, as well as the impact that they can have on your organization should they become unavailable. As for how these things are done in practice, organizations are required to have asset inventories for their assets. So typically they'd be required to have an asset register covering their hardware, any software that they use as a business. It's also important to have an inventory for your data. So any data types you have within your business need to be identified. It's also important to have an inventory of your supplier services. So as we've said before, risk is not just something that originates internally, but also comes from outside the business as well. So any suppliers you work with, particularly those that you have to share information with or give access to your systems, that presents a risk too. So it's important to document those suppliers and the services they're providing you so that you know what risks they can present to your business. If your company has a company network, then it's important to document or to illustrate your network with network diagrams so that you know what your network communication channels are, as well as any data flow channels that exist as well. And then lastly, once we've identified our assets, we need to prioritize them based on their classification, their criticality, and their overall importance to the business as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Mark. So you also mentioned how the identify function requires organisations to assess their cybersecurity risks. For an organisation that's struggling to understand its cybersecurity risks, what practical steps does the CSF provide for them to do this?
So the way NIST proposes organisations conduct their risk assessments is by taking an asset-based approach. So we've already identified our assets. What are the cybersecurity risks to those assets is essentially the strategy that NIST recommends organisations take. So the practical steps involved in this include, firstly, identifying vulnerabilities in your assets, so weaknesses that exist. So a really good example would be back in October last year, Microsoft said they were going to stop supporting Windows 10 as an operating system. So organizations that continue to use Windows 10 to this day are technically have a vulnerability because Windows 10 is no longer being supported. So look at your assets and identify weaknesses that may exist within them. We also then need to identify any internal or external threats to those assets. So whereas a vulnerability, as we've said, is a weakness relating to an asset, a threat is an event or an action that can exploit that vulnerability. So an example of this, to use the Windows 10 example, would be since Windows 10 is no longer supported, is therefore a legacy system, a threat would be that a company could be hacked because Windows 10 is more exploitable since it's no longer supported. Whilst we're in the process of identifying our security threats, we also need to take advantage of threat intelligence sources that are available. So this can be things like government agencies, cybersecurity newsletters, professional bodies who can offer valuable information to the business about the cybersecurity threats that are out there. And this can be tailored to your organization specifically, your sector, or to organizations in general. Once we've identified our threats, we then need to actually get to assessing them. So this usually involves looking at the impact of the threats if they were to materialize, as well as the likelihood of those threats taking place at all. And we then need to prioritize those threats based on the overall impact and likelihood score as well. So many organizations will use a chart such as a 5x5 chart to basically categorize their risks once they've scored them. So this would be a very efficient way to do that. Once these risks have been understood, NIST then essentially requires organizations to decide how they're going to act upon those risks once they've assessed them. So as we've mentioned before, one of the most common approaches to this is to have risk treatment criteria. So are we going to treat the risk? Are we going to terminate the risk? Are we going to transfer responsibility to a third party? Or are we going to tolerate the risk if it were to happen? Throughout this process, it's also important to mention organizations have to monitor their risk response activities as they go on to ensure that they're having the intended effect in the end. And additionally, organizations also have to consider any new risks arising from changes within the organization. So this is important because as businesses evolve and as changes evolve, such as technology changes or policy changes, changes within the business can lead to new risks. And these risks also need to be identified and managed as well. Another thing to mention is, we mentioned earlier about IT equipment. Another thing that NIST requires is organizations have to look at the authenticity and integrity of their hardware, as well as their software. So for companies who have limited internal IT resources, for example, this can be done by purchasing hardware exclusively from approved manufacturers, only purchasing software from providers that we know are trustworthy. Of course, NIST doesn't prescribe how organizations are to do this, since every organization is different. But the high-level requirement is that organizations have to essentially make sure that any hardware or software that they're planning to use is trustworthy before they use it. And the very last thing to mention on this one is that organizations have to assess any critical suppliers that they're planning to work with. So essentially, any supplier that could present a significant risk to the business from a security standpoint needs to be checked in advance. So this is typically done by conducting some form of due diligence. So this could be a due diligence assessment or a questionnaire. You could speak with the suppliers, but another way you could do that is by obtaining any security certifications they may have for assurance.
You also highlighted that Identify asks organisations to pinpoint areas for improvement in their cybersecurity programme. Where does the CSF say organisations should look in order to identify these improvements?
The Identify function encourages organisations to take an attitude of continual improvement throughout the NIST lifecycle. So whether you're an organisation that's just starting in your cybersecurity journey, or if you're an organisation where your security controls are already embedded into your operations, having an attitude of continual improvement when it comes to cybersecurity is very important. First of all, because it helps to ensure that you're continually resilient and adaptable to evolving threats, but it also helps to make your processes more efficient, less burdensome, and more of a business enabler by keeping your cybersecurity program up to date and capable of responding to new threats, as we've said. So as to how these improvements can be identified, so NIST recommends organizations look for improvements in any security tests or exercises that they conduct internally. So for example, if your organization conducts regular incident response exercises, this would be a great way to look for improvements in how you respond to security incidents. This also includes any exercises you do in collaboration or coordination with third parties. So for example, if you have a third-party supplier that you hire to conduct penetration tests or security audits, such as ourselves, for example, this would be an example of exercises done with third parties. Improvements can also be sought by simply executing your operational activities. So quite simply watching how your business operates and assess and reviewing your operational activities over time. And then lastly, improvements can be identified by establishing incident response plans and other relevant security plans, and improving these plans over time by reviewing them on a regular basis, having these reviews done by competent and appropriate management, and then adapting these plans in order to be more efficient and help the business respond to incidents more effectively over time.
Amazing. Thanks, Mark. There's a lot of common sense stuff in there that all businesses should be doing anyway, isn't there? So fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Mark. If any of our listeners would like to read up on this subject a little bit more, we have a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called The Core Functions of NIST CSF Identify. So do go and check that out. And thank you very much for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.